I think that Ukraine is going to have to come to some sort of conclusion about what a peace settlement should and would look like.
Ultimately, that the president's primary focus is to end these endless wars and to keep war small at best.
You're watching Restoring America, where we shine a light on the fundamental values of this country and all the reasons why they're worth saving. This week, we're going to talk about one of the epicenters of global conflict today, Ukraine, and whether President-elect Donald Trump really can end that conflict with just a single phone call. I'm Kaylee McGee-White, and this is Restoring America. The war in Ukraine has not just been a global conflict, it has also been a political conflict within the United States. The Republican Party specifically finds itself divided over how to best handle Russia's aggression in the region, especially since the war shows no sign of abating even after the U.S. has sent $56 billion and counting to the Ukrainians. Vice President-elect J.D. Vance represents a side of the GOP that is increasingly skeptical of continued funding for Ukraine. President-elect Donald Trump has not said one way or the other what he plans to do in regards to funding the Ukrainian war effort, but he has made clear that his objective is peace, and that he believes he can achieve that with just one phone call to Vladimir Putin. But will that be enough in a world where, thanks to the Biden administration, our enemies have less respect for us than ever before? Trump is inheriting a world on fire, the reality of which could make it exceedingly difficult to pursue a foreign policy that truly puts America first. My guests today are going to explain more about what to expect on the Ukrainian front and from Trump's foreign policy in general. But before we get to them, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, and for more, head to washingtonexaminer.com. With me today is George Bogdan, a Blankley Fellow for the Steamboat Institute, and David Rader, a former Defense Department official. Thank you both so much for being here. Obviously, the Ukrainian war is still ongoing, and the election of Donald Trump will certainly impact that. How do both of you see Donald Trump's election and his potential foreign policy vision impacting the war in Ukraine, specifically whether it will bring that war to a speedier end?
My view is that Ukraine's position has not dramatically improved or dramatically gotten worse in the last couple of months. What has changed, of course, is the dynamic in the United States as we expect President Trump to take office once again. And I will say that I think those who say that he's out to sell out Ukraine are kind of overstating his position. And in reality, his first round of appointments suggests he's going to have a much more nuanced approach. I think that Ukraine is going to have to come to some sort of conclusion about what a peace settlement should and would look like. I think that has been a bit of a not allowed as a topic for too long, but I think that's going to be part of the conversation. And President Trump's going to try to move the Ukrainian government and the Russian government towards some kind of settlement in the near term. That's my read.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers out there vary, but the rough estimates are that the Russians are expending 1,000 soldiers a day, either killed or wounded, and replenishing 1,000 soldiers a day too. So the math is not friendly towards the Ukrainians. And so ultimately President Trump, is looking at that calculus and thinking of ways in which he can kind of mitigate the sustained losses felt by the Ukrainians, the U.S. expenditure, and hoping that either NATO allies and partners can step up to the plate, but ultimately that, the president's primary focus is to end these endless wars and to keep war small at best.
As president-elect, if I win this election, the first thing I'm going to do is call up Zelensky and call up President Putin, and I'm going to say, you got to make a deal. This is crazy.
So he's really going to be pushing to wrap this up, to fence off what advances Russia has made, and to put Ukraine in a position where that it can come to the negotiating table and that this does not persist through multi-year, multi-generational conflict.
And George, David brings up an important point about how the numbers themselves don't look great for the Ukrainians, because even Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky has suggested that they will have to escalate the conflict in one way or another, whether that's trying to obtain nuclear weapons or trying to obtain a membership into some sort of alliance like NATO. Do you think either of those are realistic options? Do you think Donald Trump would entertain either of those options? What do you think is the path forward?
Well, I can't speak for President Trump. And in my earlier answer, one of the things I really wanted to get at is that I think President Trump understands that any negotiation involves some deception. And so I think he's been intentionally unclear about which options he would exercise. But that in itself provides him with a greater deal of leverage. And that's a kind of wisdom in terms of how he approaches this sort of foreign policy issue. I will say that I think the president of the United States has a long legacy of American involvement in Ukraine, regardless of who the president is. They have to contend with. You know that I've done quite a bit of research on Ukraine's decision to give up nuclear weapons and the so-called security assurances that it was previously given. And so I think that Ukrainians are quite skeptical about future arrangements, and that's something we'll have to overcome in terms of a crisis of credibility. But one thing I really want to drive home is that when I look at numbers, I think that for the broader region of Central and Eastern Europe, there's a potential that President Trump is really going to change the game. From 2016 to 2020, NATO allies increased their spending by 130 billion US dollars. And that's an extraordinary increase for that set of allies. And so the outlook of Europe as a kind of stable continent with the capacity to defend itself, potentially led by a Central and Eastern European coalition of states that are taking a louder, a kind of clearer role in the alliance, I think is a very important possibility that I'm quite optimistic about.
David, do you agree, as someone who has worked previously in the Defense Department, do you see a sort of re-envisioning of some of the United States' alliances in that region and even elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly a gravitational pull away from Paris through Berlin over now to Warsaw, to Bucharest, you're seeing on the 3C initiatives countries. I mean, that's really where we're starting to see our greatest alignment with economic alignment, military alignment, interoperability from a military standpoint, alignment, how to respond to the coercive capital coming out of China. And so I think that President Trump has acknowledged that there's meaningful partnership in Western Europe, but Eastern Europe is the real frontier for us, where the most meaningful relationships, bilateral, multilateral, will be built, and they're built off that foundation of similar views on immigration, on economics, and on national security, defense, and those kind of healthy ecosystems that he's trying to preserve. So I can imagine that President Trump and future Secretary Marco Rubio will be indexing on that part of the Europe for the transatlantic relationship.
And one last question for both of you. I want to talk about foreign policy strategically in the future. What do both of you hope from the next Trump administration? Obviously, you've both mentioned Trump's previous emphasis on an end to the endless wars. But what are you expecting or hoping for from this administration in maybe even his first few months in office?
Well, I have a deep belief that President Trump is going to seize on what I think is a tremendously important kind of historic moment. And for me, it was symbolized by a kind of constellation or a succession of events. First, we have the election taking place in the United States, and then we have the 35th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. And then we have the fall of a German government that has been in kind of lockstep with President Biden on a Ukraine policy that has failed, that has deeply harmed, I think, the Ukrainian people in the sense that it hasn't provided enough aid at the right moments decisively. And so I think for me, those kind of succession of events demonstrate that we're at a moment, an inflection point, where there's a tremendous amount of opportunity for President Trump to come in and reimagine how he's going to engage with Europe, and to kind of bring allies who have previously been pushed to the periphery back to the table and part of a broader conversation where we revive things like the 3Cs initiative, which David mentioned, but also kind of rethink the kind of fragmented relationship with China that Europe has had and try to unify around certain transatlantic principles.
Yeah, and I'll amplify George's comments there around China. I mean, I think President Trump and, again, Secretary Rubio will be pushing towards really building a coalition on Eastern European partners around how to counter China, how to mitigate it, how to screen investments, how to do technology protection, and find meaningful partners there that view China through the same lens. And that's not to downplay what's happening in Ukraine. That's not to dismiss, Russia. But it is to say that I think President Trump will view that as a European problem to meaningfully lead and address whatever that looks like, but that the U.S. needs to get back to facing its core adversary in China and really pulling in allies and partners along that same vein. And so he's going to probably zero in on getting that Eastern Bloc really to represent the European interests in keeping China at bay, letting them be a trade partner the same way they're in the United States, but not letting them encroach further into the fabric that is Europe and erode some of that economic prowess and certainly degrade whatever military and technological capabilities China is interested in doing to Eastern Europe and then Europe at large, and of course, ultimately the West.
Absolutely. Well, great analysis from both of you. Thanks so much for joining. We appreciate it. And for more breaking news, exclusive interviews, and conservative views, be sure to check out washingtonexaminer.com.